I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson, but Thomas specifically asked that we seat you at a different table tonight. The maitre d's apologetic smile couldn't soften the sting of his words. I stood frozen in the elegant entrance of Cascade View, clutching my handbag, the restaurant's soft lighting suddenly feeling harsh and exposing. My navy pantsuit, the one I'd carefully chosen for this dinner, felt too tight around my shoulders. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. There must be some mistake, I said, keeping my voice steady, despite the knot forming in my stomach. This is a family dinner to celebrate Horizon Technology's latest investment round. I'm Thomas's mother. The young man checked his tablet again, his discomfort evident. I understand, Mrs. Wilson, but I have a note here that says you should be seated separately from the main party. Mr. Wilson mentioned something about not wanting to overwhelm potential investors with too many people. I glanced past the maître d' toward the private dining section where I could see my son Thomas holding court. At 38, he looked every inch the successful tech CEO in his tailored suit, gesturing animatedly as his business partner Daniel nodded along. My daughter-in-law Rebecca sat beside him, elegant in a black dress, while various people I recognized as Horizon's executive team and a few unfamiliar faces, presumably the investors, filled the remaining seats. No empty chair waited for me. Thomas did invite me, I insisted, pulling out my phone to show the text message. He specifically said 7 o'clock, family celebration dinner, important announcement. The maitre d' glanced at my screen, and his expression grew even more uncomfortable. Perhaps you could join them for dessert. I can seat you at our lounge area until then. The lounge area, where they put people waiting for tables or guests not quite important enough for the main dining room. I was being sidelined at my own son's celebration, a celebration that wouldn't be happening without me. Margaret! I turned to see Helen Chen approaching, elegant as always in her crimson blazer, her silver hair styled in a sleek bob. My closest friend since our days working together at Pacific Northwest Financial, Helen had been my rock through my husband's death 12 years ago, and every challenge since. What are you doing in the lobby? I thought you'd be inside already. Celebrating Thomas's big investment news, she said. I lowered my voice. Apparently I'm not invited to sit with the main party. Helen's eyebrows shot up. What? That's ridiculous. Before I could respond, I spotted Thomas excusing himself from the table. He walked toward us, his expression shifting from confident CEO to something more guarded when he saw me speaking with Helen. Mom, you're early, he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek with practiced casualness. The scent of his expensive cologne couldn't mask the tension coming off him in waves. Actually, I'm right on time, I replied, showing him my watch. Your text said 7. Thomas ran a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood whenever he was caught in a lie. Right, about that. We had to rearrange some seating at the last minute. These Silicon Valley investors are particular about intimate gatherings. So particular that there's no room for your mother? Helen asked, her tone pleasant but pointed. Thomas shot her an irritated glance before forcing his features back into a conciliatory smile. It's just business, Mom. You understand how these things work. Why don't you have a drink at the bar and we'll catch up after the main discussion? This deal is crucial for Horizon. I studied my son's face. The face I'd kissed goodnight for 18 years. The face that had looked up at me with such trust and admiration when he was young. When had that changed? When had I become an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person to be respected? I see, I said simply. Great. Thomas's relief was palpable. The bartender here makes an excellent martini. My treat, of course. Thomas, Rebecca called from the dining room doorway. Everyone's waiting for you to continue. Coming! He squeezed my shoulder. We'll talk later, Mom. There's a lot to catch up on. As he turned to walk away, Rebecca caught my eye. Instead of the warm smile my daughter-in-law usually offered, her expression held something closer to pity mingled with discomfort. She quickly averted her gaze and looped her arm through Thomas's as they returned to the private dining room. Well, Helen said after they'd disappeared, that was illuminating. Indeed. I adjusted my jacket, straightening my shoulders. Let me guess, you weren't invited either? Helen's laugh held no humor. On the contrary, I received a very specific invitation from Thomas last week. As the managing partner of Evergreen Venture Capital, my presence was apparently essential. The pieces clicked into place with a clarity that took my breath away. Helen was here as a potential investor, not as my friend. And Thomas hadn't wanted me at the table because he doesn't want you to know I'm involved in his funding round. Helen realized aloud, reaching the same conclusion. Or he doesn't want potential investors to see his elderly mother and make assumptions about his decision-making, I added, the bitter truth settling heavily on my shoulders. At 65, I was hardly elderly. After 30 years as a financial executive specializing in tech investments and 5 years on the board of Pacific Northwest Financial before my retirement, I was more qualified to evaluate Thomas's business than most of the people sitting at that table. But recently, Thomas had begun treating my input with increasing dismissiveness. You're from a different era, Mom, he'd said last month when I questioned his expansion strategy. The tech world moves faster now. Things have changed since your day. My day. As if my 5 decades of experience had expired like milk left too long in the refrigerator. Margaret, Helen's voice pulled me from my thoughts. How much does Thomas know about your current role at Evergreen? I smiled then, a small, tight smile that held no joy but perhaps a touch of anticipation. Nothing. He knows I consult occasionally since retiring, but he's never bothered to ask for details. What my son didn't realize, what he'd never bothered to discover, was that 3 years ago, Helen had persuaded me to join Evergreen Venture Capital as a silent partner and their lead advisor on tech investments. My retirement portfolio had become the cornerstone of their newest fund, the very fund Thomas was eagerly courting for Horizon's Series B financing. In simple terms, my son had no idea that I controlled the purse strings of the very money he was trying to secure tonight. Well, Helen said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. This should be interesting. The maître d' approached us again, clearly uncomfortable with our continued presence in the entryway. Ladies, perhaps you'd like to wait in the lounge area? I can bring you a complimentary glass of champagne. I exchanged glances with Helen, a silent communication born of decades of friendship. Actually, Helen said, pulling out her business card and handing it to the flustered young man, I believe you'll find I'm expected at Mr. Wilson's table. I'm Helen Chen, managing partner at Evergreen Venture Capital. His eyes widened as he recognized the name. Of course, Ms. Chen. They've been waiting for you. Please, follow me. And Mrs. Wilson will be joining me, Helen added firmly. But he looked down at his tablet, conflict evident on his face. Mrs. Wilson is Evergreen's senior investment advisor, Helen continued smoothly. Her presence is non-negotiable for any discussion regarding Horizon Technologies funding. The maître d' hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Of course. Right this way, ladies. As we followed him toward the private dining room, I touched Helen's arm. You don't have to do this. Oh, but I do, she replied, adjusting her blazer. Not just for you, but for every elderly woman who's been underestimated by some young hotshot who thinks gray hair means obsolescence. We paused at the entrance to the private dining room. Through the doorway, I could see Thomas mid-presentation, gesturing toward a sleek digital display showing Horizon's impressive growth projections. His confident voice carried clearly. which is why Horizon is uniquely positioned to dominate this emerging market segment. With your investment, we can accelerate our development timeline and capture significant market share before the bigger players even realize the opportunity exists. I recognized the pitch. It was solid. I should know since I'd helped him refine similar presentations in Horizon's early days. Before he decided my business acumen had expired, the maître d' cleared his throat. "Mr. Wilson, Ms. Chen has arrived." Thomas turned, his professional smile freezing slightly as he saw me standing beside Helen. Everyone at the table looked our way. "Helen, wonderful to see you." Thomas recovered quickly, stepping forward to shake her hand. "We've been eagerly awaiting your arrival." "I wouldn't miss it," Helen replied warmly. "I hope you don't mind that I brought along my colleague. I believe you know Margaret Wilson?" Thomas's face performed a fascinating series of micro-expressions: confusion, realization, alarm, and finally a strained smile. "Of course. Mom, I didn't realize you and Helen would be coming together." "Colleague?" Daniel Brooks, Thomas's business partner, looked between us with confusion. "Your mother works with Evergreen Venture Capital." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. "Perhaps we should all sit down," Helen suggested smoothly, "and Margaret can explain her role at Evergreen while we enjoy this lovely dinner." Thomas pulled out a chair beside his movements mechanical. "Yes, of course. Mom, please join us." As I took my seat, Rebecca leaned over to whisper something to Thomas. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Around the table, curious glances darted between us, the atmosphere shifting from polished business dinner to something far more interesting. "Well," I said, placing my napkin in my lap and offering a smile to the table at large, "this should be an illuminating evening for everyone." Indeed it would be. After years of being increasingly sidelined and dismissed by my son, tonight would change everything. Thomas was about to learn that assuming his mother was too old to be relevant had been his most expensive mistake yet. The waiter appeared with water and wine, offering a momentary distraction from the tension. I used the opportunity to study the other faces around the table. Besides Thomas, Rebecca, and Daniel, I recognized Horizon's young Chief Technology Officer, Aiden, and their newly hired Chief Marketing Officer, whose name escaped me. The remaining 4 guests were unfamiliar, presumably the Silicon Valley investors Thomas had mentioned. "Perhaps introductions are in order," Helen suggested once the waiter had departed. "Not everyone here may know everyone else." Thomas cleared his throat. "Of course. Everyone, this is Helen Chen, managing partner at Evergreen Venture Capital, and my mother, Margaret Wilson." He turned to gesture toward the others. "Helen, Mom, these are our friends from Redwood Partners, James Liu and Sophia Patel, and from Sequoia Ridge Investments, we have Alex Rodriguez and Priya Nair." The investors nodded politely. James Liu, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s, studied me with particular interest. "Wilson," he said. "Any relation to William Wilson from Pacific Northwest Financial?" "My late husband," I confirmed with a small smile. "I worked with him briefly in the early 2000s. Brilliant man, especially when it came to evaluating tech potential before others saw it." James raised his glass slightly. "My condolences, though I realize it's been some time." "Thank you. And yes, Bill had a knack for spotting tomorrow's tech winners," I agreed. "A quality I like to think rubbed off after 30 years of marriage." "Mom was in finance too," Thomas interjected, clearly trying to steer the conversation. "Before retirement, of course." "Not just in finance," Helen corrected. "Margaret was Pacific Northwest Financial's Executive Vice President of Technology Investments for over a decade, and before that, she built their tech portfolio from practically nothing into the firm's most profitable division." I could see Thomas processing this information, his expression suggesting he'd forgotten, or perhaps never fully appreciated, the extent of my career. That's impressive, Sophia Patel commented. You must have seen the industry transform completely during your tenure. Several times over, I agreed. From the first dot-com boom and bust through social media, mobile revolution, cloud computing. Technology evolves, but sound business fundamentals and the ability to evaluate true innovation versus hype remain constant. Mom has always had valuable insights, Thomas said, his tone hovering somewhere between genuine acknowledgement and damage control. But as we were discussing before you arrived, Horizon is operating in a very specific niche with unique challenges and opportunities. The AI-enhanced supply chain management space, I said, nodding. Leveraging machine learning to predict inventory needs and optimize distribution networks for mid-sized manufacturers. Yes, I'm familiar with your business model, Thomas. His surprise was evident, though he tried to hide it. You've been keeping up with our progress? Of course, I replied simply. Just because you stopped asking for my input doesn't mean I stopped paying attention to my son's company. An uncomfortable silence followed my statement. Rebecca took a large sip of her wine. Forgive me, James Liu interjected with diplomatic smoothness. But Helen, you introduced Mrs. Wilson as your colleague at Evergreen. I'm curious about her. Roll there. All eyes turned to me. Thomas's expression was particularly desperate, silently pleading with me not to say anything that might jeopardize his deal. Helen smiled. Margaret is being characteristically modest. She's not just my colleague. She's Evergreen's senior investment advisor for technology ventures and a significant partner in our third fund, the very fund Thomas has been courting for Horizon's Series B round. The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas stared at me, his face draining of color as the implications sank in. You're part of the investment committee for Evergreen's fund? He finally managed. I'm afraid it's a bit more than that, I replied calmly. I structured the fund, Thomas. My portfolio forms its foundation, and no major investment moves forward without my approval. Thomas blinked rapidly, his entrepreneur's mind clearly racing to recalculate the evening's dynamics. His carefully orchestrated pitch, his strategic seating arrangements, his decision to sideline his elderly mother, all of it had just collapsed spectacularly. Daniel Brooks let out a strangled laugh. So you're saying that the funding we've been pursuing for the past 3 months is largely contingent on Margaret's recommendation, Helen finished for him. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Thomas finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I met my son's gaze steadily. You never asked, Thomas. In recent years, you've made it increasingly clear that you consider my experience outdated and my input unwelcome. You stopped sharing details about Horizon. You began canceling our monthly lunches. When I offered suggestions, you dismissed them as coming from a different era. Thomas had the grace to look ashamed. Perhaps, Priya Nair from Sequoia Ridge suggested diplomatically, this presents a unique opportunity. Mrs. Wilson clearly has both institutional knowledge and personal investment in Horizon's success. That combination of experience and motivation could be tremendously valuable. Precisely what I've been thinking, Helen agreed. Which is why I suggested to our investment committee last week that any funding package should include a board observer seat for Margaret. Thomas's head snapped up. A board seat? But we've already structured the governance. Observer seat, Helen corrected. Non-voting, but with full access to information and meetings. A standard protective measure for significant investments. It would add tremendous credibility, James Liu noted, studying Thomas's reaction carefully. Having someone with Mrs. Wilson's background providing oversight would actually make the investment more attractive to our firm. I watched my son grappling with this dramatic shift. The funding he desperately needed for Horizon now seemed to be tied directly to accepting his mother's involvement, the very thing he'd been systematically eliminating. I think it's a wonderful idea, Rebecca suddenly interjected, surprising. Everyone, including Thomas. She placed her hand over her husband's. Your mother's experience would be invaluable, Thomas. And I know how much you've missed her insight, even if you haven't admitted it. Her words seemed to penetrate Thomas's shock. He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. Not as his elderly mother, an obligation to be managed, but as Margaret Wilson, the accomplished finance executive who had helped countless tech companies navigate growth and challenges. Mom, he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything right now, I replied gently. This dinner was meant to be a celebration of Horizon's potential. Let's continue with that purpose. I turned to the investors. I've thoroughly reviewed Horizon's business model, financial projections, and technology roadmap. While I obviously have a personal connection, I've evaluated the company with the same rigorous standards I'd apply to any potential investment. I believe Horizon has identified a genuine market opportunity and possesses both the technical capability and business acumen to capitalize on it. Thomas stared at me, clearly startled by my comprehensive understanding of his company. That said, I continued, there are aspects of their expansion strategy and customer acquisition approach that merit refinement. With proper guidance and sufficient capital, I see a clear path to making Horizon the dominant player in their niche within 3 years. The investors were nodding, clearly impressed. Thomas looked simultaneously proud and discomfited, grateful for my endorsement, but struggling with this new reality where his mother held significant influence over his company's future. The dinner continued with a fascinating new dynamic. Technical questions about Horizon's AI algorithms were directed to Aidan, the CTO. Marketing strategies were discussed with their CMO. But the nuanced financial questions and big-picture strategic inquiries increasingly came my way, with even Thomas deferring to my expertise on certain matters. By the time dessert arrived, the atmosphere had transformed. What had begun as a tense, awkward collision of worlds had evolved into a genuinely productive business discussion, with all parties contributing meaningfully. The Silicon Valley investors were engaged, asking thoughtful questions that suggested serious interest rather than polite consideration. As coffee was served, Helen caught my eye with a small, satisfied nod. The message was clear. Evergreen would be moving forward with the investment, and the other firms seemed likely to follow suit. Thomas leaned toward me while the others were distracted by the dessert selection. Mom, I owe you an apology, he said quietly. A big one. Yes, you do, I agreed, but softened it with a small smile. Though perhaps this evening has been enlightening for both of us. He nodded, genuine regret in his eyes. I've been arrogant and dismissive. I convinced myself that your experience wasn't relevant anymore, that I needed to forge my own path completely separate from yours and Dad's legacy. Independence is natural, I acknowledged. But dismissing wisdom simply because of its source is foolish, something your father would have told you himself. Thomas smiled sadly at the mention of his father. He would have called me an idiot, and he'd have been right. Well, you come by it honestly. Bill was equally stubborn until life taught him a few hard lessons. I patted his hand. The difference is whether you learn from the lesson or continue to repeat the mistake. Around us, the dinner was winding down, investors exchanging business cards and making promises to follow up. The funding round that Thomas had been so nervously pursuing now seemed virtually assured. Does this mean you'll accept the board observer position? Thomas asked hesitantly. I considered him thoughtfully. That depends. Are you asking because you've realized the value I could bring? Or because you feel cornered by the funding conditions? My son had the grace to look chagrined. After a moment's reflection, he replied, Both, if I'm being completely honest. but I'm hoping we can move past my short-sightedness. I'd welcome your input, Mom, not just as a condition of funding, but because I've missed having you in my corner. I've always been in your corner, Thomas, I said softly, even when you pushed me away. Our conversation was interrupted as Helen rose to her feet, gently tapping her water glass with a spoon. The table quieted, all eyes turning to her. I'd like to propose a toast, she announced, raising her glass. To Horizon Technologies and its leadership team. You've created something with genuine potential, and I'm pleased to confirm that Evergreen Venture Capital is prepared to lead your Series B funding round, subject to final documentation and due diligence. Applause broke out around the table. Thomas's face lit up with relief and joy. Daniel Brooks looked like he might cry from happiness. The other investors were nodding along, clearly planning to join the round now that Evergreen had committed. And, Helen continued once the excited murmurs had quieted, to new beginnings and rediscovered wisdom. May we all remember that innovation doesn't just come from the young, and experience doesn't expire with age. Hear, hear, James Liu agreed, raising his glass higher. As we all clinked glasses, Thomas leaned close to whisper in my ear. I guess I should consider myself lucky that you decided to teach me a lesson rather than simply rejecting our funding application outright. I smiled, taking a sip of my champagne before responding. That was never an option, Thomas. Horizon is a sound investment with excellent potential. And besides, I added with a wink, I may be your mother, but I'm a businesswoman first. I wouldn't let a personal grievance interfere with a promising opportunity. Thomas laughed, a genuine laugh that reminded me of the little boy who used to look at me with such admiration. That's exactly why we need you, Mom. That clarity, that perspective. As the evening wound down and we prepared to leave, I found myself standing beside Rebecca near the coat room. Thank you, she said quietly, for what you did tonight. I'm not sure what you mean, I replied, accepting my coat from the attendant. Rebecca glanced around to ensure we weren't overheard. Thomas has been struggling. Horizon is doing well on paper, but he's been making decisions in a vacuum, surrounding himself with people who won't challenge him. He stopped listening to Daniel months ago. When he started dismissing your input too, I knew it was a bad sign. I studied my daughter-in-law with new appreciation. You've been worried about him. She nodded. About the company too. Our entire future is tied up in Horizon. Our home, Ethan's college fund, everything. Thomas needed this wake-up call, and it needed to come from someone he couldn't simply override or ignore. Like his mother who controls his funding, I observed. Wryly. Rebecca smiled. Exactly, though I had no idea you were involved with Evergreen. That was a masterstroke. Life has a way of creating interesting intersections, I said. I didn't plan this particular lesson, but perhaps it was overdue. Thomas approached, shrugging into his coat. Ready to go, ladies? I've called for cars. Actually, I said, I thought we might continue our conversation. Perhaps you could come back to my place for a nightcap? There's much we should discuss about next steps. Thomas looked surprised but pleased. I'd like that very much. As we stepped out into the cool Seattle evening, Thomas offered me his arm. I took it, feeling a bridge being rebuilt between us, one that might ultimately be stronger than what had existed before. My son had thought me too old to contribute meaningfully to his business world. He'd sidelined me, dismissed my experience, and tonight had quite literally tried to seat me at a different table. But now he understood a fundamental truth that many learn too late. Age brings wisdom that no amount of youthful energy can replace, and underestimating someone based on their gray hair might just be the most expensive mistake you ever make. The three of us, Thomas, Rebecca, and I, sat in my living room overlooking Lake Washington. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle's city lights twinkled across the water, creating a glittering backdrop for what had already been an eventful evening. I'd poured us each a glass of the 30-year-old Macallan that Bill had saved for special occasions. This certainly qualified. Thomas sat forward on the edge of the sofa, turning the crystal tumbler in his hands. The confident CEO persona he'd worn at dinner had given way to something more vulnerable, more like the son I remembered. "I still can't believe you've been with Evergreen all this time," he said, shaking his head. 3 years? 2 years. And 8 months, I corrected, settling into my favorite armchair. Helen approached me shortly after I left the Pacific Northwest Financial Board. She needed someone who understood technology investment risk assessment, especially for AI and machine learning ventures, which happens to be exactly what Horizon specializes in, Rebecca noted, slipping off her heels and tucking her feet beneath her on the sofa. A coincidence, I assured them. When I joined Evergreen, Horizon was still focused on inventory management software. The AI component came later. Thomas looked up sharply. "You've really been following our development that closely?" I took a measured sip of my scotch. "Thomas, just because you stopped sharing information with me doesn't mean I stopped caring about your company. I've read every press release, every industry mention, and every regulatory filing Horizon has made. I've tracked your product evolution, partnership announcements, and executive hires." "That's thorough," Thomas said, clearly unsure whether to be impressed or unnerved. "It's what I do," I replied simply. "For every potential investment." The phrase hung in the air between us. Thomas winced slightly at the reminder that I now viewed his company, the business he'd built with such pride, through the dispassionate lens of an investor rather than just as his adoring mother. Rebecca broke the silence. "Margaret, can I ask? When Thomas submitted the funding proposal to Evergreen, did you know immediately?" I nodded. "Helen brought it to me the same day. She thought it was, what did she call it? Karmically appropriate." "And you didn't say anything," Thomas said. Not a question, but an observation tinged with hurt. "What would you have had me say?" I asked, meeting his gaze steadily. "Surprise, son. I'm evaluating whether your company deserves several $1 million of investment capital, including a substantial portion of my retirement portfolio. Would that have been welcome news 3 months ago, given how you've been treating my input?" Thomas had the grace to look ashamed. He set his glass down on the coffee table and ran both hands through his hair. Another gesture I recognized from his childhood, a tell that he was processing uncomfortable truths. "I've been a jackass," he admitted finally. "Yes," I agreed mildly. Rebecca snorted, quickly covering it with a cough when Thomas shot her a betrayed look. "Don't look at me like that," she said, patting his knee. "She's right, and you know it. You've been dismissing your mother's expertise for months now. Remember what you said when she questioned the Westlake acquisition?" Thomas groaned. "I believe..." My exact words were, "Mom, with all due respect, tech acquisition strategy has evolved since your day." "And then you paid twice what Westlake was worth and had to write down the investment 6 months later," I added. "While your mother's assessment of their technology assets turned out to be spot on," Rebecca finished. Thomas looked between us, realization dawning. "You two have been talking." "We have lunch every few weeks," Rebecca confirmed. "Someone had to keep Margaret informed about what was happening at Horizon, since you decided her business acumen had expired." I gave my daughter-in-law a grateful smile. Though I'd never pushed Rebecca to share information about Horizon, her occasional updates had filled in gaps in my understanding that public documents couldn't provide. Her loyalty to Thomas had never wavered, but her frustration with his treatment of me and his increasingly isolated decision-making had led to our quiet alliance. "I suspected as much," Thomas said, but there was no anger in his voice, just weary acknowledgement. He looked at me with genuine regret. "Mom, I don't even know how to begin apologizing. I've been so caught up in proving myself, in showing that I could build something significant on my own merits rather than trading on the Wilson name. That you decided the best way to demonstrate your independence was to reject everything associated with your parents' world, I finished for him. Including your mother's experience and network. It sounds so petty when you put it that way. Because it is petty, I said, not unkindly, and foolish. Business isn't about reinventing every wheel, Thomas. It's about recognizing which wheels work, which need improvements, and which should be discarded entirely. Experience helps distinguish between them. He nodded slowly. I think I needed to learn that the hard way. Most people do, I acknowledged. Your father certainly did. That caught Thomas's attention. Dad? But he was always so measured, so strategic. I couldn't help but laugh. The William Wilson you knew as a father was not the same man I met 40 years ago. Back then, he was brilliant but reckless, convinced he knew better than everyone with more experience, determined to make his mark by breaking all the established rules. Really? Thomas looked genuinely surprised. The idea that his steady, methodical father had once been as impulsive as himself clearly hadn't occurred to him. Oh yes. When we first started dating, he was trying to launch a financial services platform that would disrupt the entire banking industry, I said, smiling at the memory. He ignored every piece of regulatory advice, burned through his initial funding in 6 months, and nearly got himself barred from the securities industry. Rebecca leaned forward, intrigued. What happened? His main investor, a man named Arthur Granville, saw Bill's potential despite his stubborn recklessness. Instead of pulling funding entirely, Arthur insisted on bringing in an experienced financial strategist as a condition for the next round. I smiled. That strategist helped Bill reshape his vision into something revolutionary but viable. They salvaged the core innovation while building a sustainable business model around it. Understanding dawned in Thomas's eyes. The strategist was you. I nodded. I was 26, 5 years into my career at First Seattle Investment Group. Arthur was my boss. He assigned me to evaluate your father's company, and I delivered a brutally honest assessment. Which Dad hated, Thomas guessed. Passionately, I confirmed with a chuckle. He called me a narrow-minded, conventional thinker who wouldn't recognize true innovation if it danced naked on my balance sheet. Rebecca burst out laughing. That does not sound like the William Wilson I knew. People change, I said simply. Bill learned, slowly and painfully, that innovation without practical implementation is just an expensive hobby. Eventually, he came to value my perspective. We became partners in business long before we became partners in life. Thomas was quiet for a moment, absorbing this new understanding of his parents' history. I had no idea your relationship started that way. Why would you? By the time you were old enough to understand business, your father and I had developed a seamless working dynamic. You never saw the arguments, the clashes of perspective, the difficult compromises that got us there. I rose to refill my scotch, using the moment to gather my thoughts. When I turned back to face my son, I decided complete honesty was called for. Thomas, what hurt most these past few years wasn't that you rejected my advice. It was that you stopped even considering it worth hearing. You didn't argue with my perspective or challenge my assumptions. You simply dismissed me as irrelevant because of my age. Thomas winced visibly. I didn't think of it that way. Didn't you? I asked quietly. Last Thanksgiving, when I suggested that Horizon's pricing model might be undercutting your long-term service revenue, you patted my hand and said, "Things work differently in modern SaaS businesses, Mom. It's not like the old days." I remember, he admitted. You didn't engage with my actual point. You didn't ask why I was concerned about the service margin compression. You just assumed that my thinking was outdated because I'm over 60. Rebecca interjected gently. You've been doing it with everyone lately, Thomas. The board, Daniel, even me sometimes. If someone questions a decision, you don't address their specific concern. You frame it as them not understanding the vision or not being forward-thinking enough. Thomas looked between us, defensive at first, then gradually more reflective. He picked up his scotch and took a long swallow before responding. You're right, he said finally. Both of you. I've been insulated, surrounding myself with people who won't challenge me, convincing myself that disagreement means people just don't understand the brilliance of what we're creating at Horizon. A common trap for successful founders, I observed. Your father fell into it as well, about 15 years into building Pacific Northwest Financial. Started believing his own mythology. What snapped him out of it? The Sherman Cooper disaster, I said, naming a notorious failed investment that had nearly destroyed the firm in the mid-1990s. Bill ignored multiple warnings from his team because he was convinced he understood the market dynamics better than anyone else. It cost the company $80 million and almost ruined our reputation in the industry. Thomas rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. I remember that period. You and Dad were arguing a lot. He was barely home for weeks. We were fighting for the company's survival, I confirmed. And for our marriage, if I'm being honest. Bill had to confront some hard truths about his leadership style and decision-making process. It was either evolve or lose everything. And tonight was my Sherman Cooper moment, Thomas said with dawning recognition. If you hadn't been connected to Evergreen, if tonight had played out the way I planned, you'd have gotten your funding, I assured him. Horizon is fundamentally sound, but you'd have continued down a dangerous path, making unilateral decisions without meaningful challenge or oversight. Rebecca squeezed his hand. The company needs your vision and drive, Thomas, but it also needs your mother's experience and strategic perspective. Thomas sat with that for a moment, then looked up at me with newfound clarity. The board observer role. You planned this all along, didn't you? From the moment Horizon's proposal came across your desk at Evergreen. I smiled. Let's say I recognized an opportunity to address several problems simultaneously. Horizon gets the capital it needs. Evergreen makes a sound investment with appropriate governance protections, and you get a wake-up call before you drive the company and yourself off a cliff. Elegantly ruthless, Thomas said, but there was admiration in his voice. You orchestrated the entire evening, didn't you? Even down to having Helen arrive at the exact moment I was trying to sideline you. I may have mentioned to Helen what time your text invited me to dinner, I acknowledged. The rest was fortunate timing. Thomas shook his head, a reluctant smile tugging at his lips. My own mother outmaneuvered me at my own funding dinner. Consider it a valuable business lesson, I replied. Never underestimate someone just because they have gray hair and sensible shoes. The three of us lapsed into comfortable silence, the tension of the evening finally dissipating. Outside, a boat moved across the lake, its lights creating ripples in the dark water. In the distance, the Seattle skyline stood as a testament to ambition and innovation, values I'd tried to instill in Thomas since childhood. Rebecca was the first to speak. So what happens now? With Horizon's funding and the board position? I set my glass down and leaned forward. That depends on Thomas. Evergreen is prepared to lead the funding round under the terms Helen outlined tonight, including my role as board observer, but it needs to be a genuine partnership, not a reluctant concession. Thomas met my gaze directly. It won't be reluctant. Tonight was illuminating in more ways than one. Seeing you handle those investors, address their concerns about our expansion strategy, articulate the value proposition more clearly than I've ever managed to do myself. He shook his head in wonder. It reminded me of watching you and Dad work together when I was growing up. that seamless combination of vision and practicality. Your father was the visionary, I reminded him. I was the one who turned those visions into viable business strategies. And that's exactly what Horizon needs right now, Thomas admitted. We have the technology, we have the market opportunity, but we're struggling with execution and strategic focus. Rebecca nodded, emphatically. The development team is building features without clear prioritization. The sales team is promising capabilities we haven't fully developed. And the financial projections? She trailed off with a grimace. Are optimistic to the point of fantasy, I finished for her. I noticed that in your proposal, particularly the customer acquisition cost assumptions and the projected service margin recovery. Thomas looked surprised. You could tell that from the proposal alone? 30 years evaluating tech companies gives you a sense for when the numbers are aspirational, I said diplomatically. But that's precisely the kind of issue a good board observer would help address before it becomes a serious problem. Thomas sat back, his expression shifting from defensive CEO to thoughtful son. You know, when Dad died, you offered to help me with the business side of Horizon. I turned you down because I wanted to prove I could do it on my own. I remember, I said softly. I think I was afraid, he continued, the admission clearly difficult for him. Afraid that if you got involved, everyone would assume any success was because of you, not me. That I'd always be Margaret and William Wilson's son, rather than Thomas Wilson in my own right. I understood that fear better than he knew. Your father struggled with similar concerns early in his career. His family had been in banking for generations. He was determined to build something that didn't have the Wilson name attached to it. That's why he called it Pacific Northwest Financial instead of Wilson Finance, Thomas realized. I nodded. And yet, despite the different name, despite building it from scratch with his own vision, it was undeniably shaped by the Wilson legacy, the values, the principles, the approach to business that defined your grandparents and great-grandparents. Just as Horizon is shaped by what I learned from you and Dad, Thomas acknowledged, whether I want to admit it or not. Exactly. You can't escape your heritage, Thomas, but you can build upon it, improve it, adapt it to changing times without discarding the wisdom that comes with it. Rebecca, who had been listening intently to our exchange, spoke up. I've been saying something similar for months, but he needed to hear it from you. She turned to Thomas. And he needed the reality check of discovering his mother controls, his funding to finally listen. Thomas laughed, the sound genuine and relaxed for the first time that evening. Nothing like finding out your mom holds the purse strings to make you reevaluate your life choices. I smiled, feeling the warmth of reconnection with my son. To be fair, I don't control all of Evergreen's decisions, but for this particular investment, I shrugged expressively. You have significant influence, Thomas finished. Enough to insist on certain governance conditions. Exactly. Thomas leaned forward, his expression turning serious again. I want you involved, Mom. Not just because Evergreen is insisting on it, or because you control part of our funding. I need your expertise. Horizon needs it. The simple acknowledgement, freely, given rather than grudgingly conceded, meant more to me than he could know. For the first time in years, my son was looking at me not as an obligation or an outdated relic, but as a valuable resource and partner. In that case, I said, perhaps we should discuss some of my observations about Horizon's current strategy, starting with the Westlake integration issues. Thomas grimaced. That obvious, huh? The technology mismatch was apparent from the initial acquisition announcement, I confirmed. Your core platform is built on a cloud-native architecture with containerized microservices. Westlake's solution is a monolithic application designed for on-premises deployment. The integration challenges were inevitable. Thomas stared at me. How do you even know those technical details? They weren't in our public statements. I read the documentation, I said simply. Both Horizon's developer portal and Westlake's technical specifications are publicly accessible if you know where to look. The architectural incompatibility was clear to anyone who took the time to examine them closely. Rebecca burst out laughing at Thomas's dumbfounded expression. See? This is exactly why we need her involved. Margaret doesn't just understand the financial aspects. She does the deep research that others skip. A habit from my early days evaluating tech investments, I explained. Bill always said I was the only financial executive he knew who actually read the technical documentation before making investment recommendations. Thomas shook his head in amazement. All this time, I've been thinking of you as, well, an elderly technophobe who wouldn't know a microservice from a microwave, I suggested wryly. He had the grace to look embarrassed. Something like that. I just assumed. That technology had evolved beyond my comprehension. Thomas, I've been evaluating technology investments since before the first .com boom. I've watched architectural paradigms come and go, and often come back again rebranded as revolutionary innovations. Rebecca leaned forward eagerly. So what would you recommend for the Westlake situation? The integration is months behind schedule and way over budget. I considered the question. You have two viable options. Either commit fully to rewriting Westlake's core functionality as native modules within your platform, which would take at least a year, but give you complete architectural consistency, or maintain them as separate products with a lightweight integration layer for data exchange. But we promised our investors a fully integrated solution, Thomas protested. You promised something that may not be technically feasible within your projected timeframe and budget, I corrected gently. It's better to reset expectations with a pragmatic approach than to continue pretending you can achieve the impossible. Thomas was quiet for a moment, processing my suggestion. The board would resist changing course. They've been adamant about delivering on the original integration promise. Perhaps they need to hear from someone with both financial and technical credibility about the realistic options, I suggested. Someone who can frame the decision in terms of business sustainability rather than just technical constraints. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Someone like my new board observer. Precisely. Thomas rubbed his chin thoughtfully. You know, that could actually work. If you presented the analysis as part of your initial governance review, it would give everyone a face-saving way to adjust course without admitting the original plan was flawed, I finished. Rebecca watched our exchange with growing enthusiasm. This is exactly what Horizon has been missing. Someone who can bridge the technical realities with the business imperatives and communicate them effectively to all stakeholders. Thomas reached for the bottle of Macallan and refreshed our glasses. To new beginnings, he proposed, raising his tumbler. And rediscovered wisdom, Rebecca added. We clinked our glasses together, the rich amber liquid catching the light from the fireplace. In that moment, I felt a shift in our family dynamic, a rebalancing that promised healthier relationships and stronger collaboration. There's something else we should discuss, I said after taking a sip. The reason I was initially excluded from tonight's dinner. Thomas's expression clouded slightly. Mom, I've apologized for that. It was thoughtless and disrespectful. I'm not looking for another apology, I assured him. I'm more interested in understanding why you felt it necessary to hide me away. Not just tonight, but increasingly over the past year or so. Thomas and Rebecca exchanged a glance. It was Rebecca who finally answered. It's complicated, she began carefully. The tech world can be ageist, especially toward women. I'm well aware, I said dryly. About 6 months ago, Thomas pitched to a major venture capital firm in San Francisco, Rebecca continued. You came up in conversation. Thomas mentioned that his mother had been in financial services. And, I prompted when she hesitated. Thomas grimaced. One of the partners made a comment about keeping the old guard away from innovation and suggested that having someone from the traditional finance world involved might signal a lack of disruptive thinking. I raised an eyebrow, and rather than challenging that ridiculous assumption, you internalized it. I didn't want anything to jeopardize our funding prospects, Thomas admitted. So I started, minimizing your connection to Horizon in investor conversations, which gradually evolved into excluding me entirely, I concluded. It sounds terrible when you put it that way, Thomas said, looking genuinely ashamed. Because it is terrible, I said firmly. You allowed someone else's prejudice to dictate how you treated your own mother, and more foolishly, you deprived your company of valuable expertise based on that same prejudice. Rebecca nodded in agreement. I told him it was a mistake, that any investor worth partnering with would see your experience as an asset, not a liability. She did, Thomas confirmed, repeatedly. And tonight proved her right, I pointed out. James Liu and Sophia Patel were clearly impressed by my background, not put off by it. Even the younger investors seemed to value the perspective I brought to the discussion. Thomas nodded slowly. I see that now. I let one biased comment from an investor we ultimately didn't even work with shape my thinking and behavior. It's a common trap, I acknowledged. Especially in environments like tech startups where youth and disruption are fetishized above all else. But the most successful technology companies combine innovation with sound business fundamentals, a lesson the industry relearns with every boom and bust cycle. Rebecca set her glass down decisively. Well, this is all going to change now. With Margaret officially involved as a board observer and Evergreen leading our funding round, we have an opportunity to reset Horizon's governance and strategic direction. Starting with a full review of our product roadmap and go-to-market strategy, Thomas added, his enthusiasm building. Mom, would you be willing to meet with our executive team next week? I think they could benefit enormously from your perspective on our expansion plans. The eager, open expression on my son's face, so reminiscent of the boy who used to ask for my help with school projects, warmed my heart. This was the Thomas I remembered, the one who valued connection and collaboration before success had tempted him into isolation and arrogance. I'd be happy to, I said, smiling. Assuming the terms of my board observer role are finalized by then. I'll have our lawyers work with Evergreen to expedite the paperwork, Thomas promised. And in the meantime, maybe we could revive our monthly lunch tradition? I'd like to start sharing Horizon's developments with you again. Properly, this time. I'd like that very much, I said softly. As the evening wound down and Thomas and Rebecca prepared to leave, my son lingered in the entryway, clearly wanting to say something more. Rebecca, sensing his need for a private moment, mentioned checking on their driver and stepped outside. Mom, Thomas began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. I just want you to know. I'm sorry. Not just for tonight or the past few months, but for how I've taken you for granted these past few years. After Dad died, I was so focused on proving myself that I pushed away the one person who always believed in me unconditionally. Oh, Thomas, I said, reaching up to touch his cheek, a gesture from his childhood. I've never stopped believing in you. Being disappointed in someone's choices doesn't mean you've stopped believing in their potential. He covered my hand with his, an unexpected sheen of tears in his eyes. I don't know if I've ever told you this, but I'm proud to be your son. Not just because of your professional accomplishments, but because of who you are. Your integrity, your resilience, your willingness to speak hard truths even when they're unwelcome. You get those qualities from both your father and me, I told him. They're in your DNA, Thomas. You just needed a reminder to access them. He smiled, then pulled me into a proper hug, the kind we hadn't shared in years. Thank you for not giving up on me, he whispered, even when I was being a complete jackass. Language, I chided automatically, then laughed. And you're welcome. That's what mothers do. We hold on to the best version of our children, even when they temporarily lose sight of it themselves. As I watched them drive away into the night, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The evening had unfolded in ways I couldn't have precisely predicted, but the essential outcome was everything I'd hoped for. A reconnection with my son, a meaningful role in his company's future, and most importantly, a restoration of mutual respect. I returned to the living room and picked up my phone to find a text from Helen. Mission accomplished? I smiled as I typed my response. Beyond expectations. Funding terms accepted. Board observer role welcomed. And most importantly, my son remembered who he is. Helen's reply came quickly. The Wilson legacy continues. Congratulations, Margaret. I looked out at the Seattle skyline, thinking about legacy. My husband's, mine, and now Thomas's. We build on what comes before us, sometimes rebelling against it, sometimes embracing it, but always, inevitably, shaped by it. Thomas had needed to forge his own path, to step out from the shadow of his successful parents. That was natural and healthy. But in his determination to be entirely self-made, he'd nearly lost the wisdom and support that could have made his journey easier and his company stronger. Tonight had been a necessary correction, a reminder that acknowledging your roots doesn't diminish your achievements, but enriches them. And perhaps, a lesson about the folly of underestimating someone simply because of their age or gender. I smiled at the thought of returning to the business world, even in this limited capacity. After years of retirement, I found myself energized by the prospect of applying my experience to new challenges, of helping shape Horizon's future alongside my son. William would have been proud of this outcome, I thought. Not just of Thomas's success with Horizon, but of how we'd found our way back to the partnership that had always defined our family at its best, different perspectives united by common values and mutual respect. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the irony of the situation. Thomas had tried to sideline me because he thought I was too old to contribute meaningfully to his modern tech company. Instead, he'd discovered that my age and experience were precisely what his company needed most, and that underestimating me had nearly cost him both his funding and our relationship. Some lessons come at a higher price than others. Fortunately, for Thomas, this one had come with a second chance to get things right. The next morning, I woke early as always. Years of financial industry deadlines had permanently set my internal clock to 5:30 a.m., regardless of when I'd gone to bed. I made my coffee and took it out onto the deck overlooking the lake, watching the mist rise off the water as Seattle slowly came alive. My phone chimed with a text from Thomas. Still on for breakfast at 8? I have so many questions about Horizon's strategic direction. I smiled at the eager tone. Just 24 hours ago, my son would have rather eaten glass than solicit my business advice. Now he couldn't wait to pick my brain. Amazing what discovering your mother controls your company's funding can do for family dynamics. I texted back a simple confirmation and settled into my morning routine, reviewing the financial news and market updates. Old habits die hard, even in semi-retirement. By the time I arrived at Elliott's Lakeside Cafe, a quiet spot known for its discretion with high-profile business meetings, Thomas was already waiting, a spread of files and his laptop open before him. "Mom," he called, standing as I approached. The genuine warmth in his greeting was a marked change from our recent interactions, where he'd often seemed impatient, as if I were an obligation to be managed rather than a parent to be cherished. "You look like you've been here a while," I observed, noting the half-empty coffee cup and scattered papers. "Since 6, he admitted with a sheepish smile. "Couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts about Horizon's future and everything we discussed. Last night, I settled into the chair across from him, ordering a fresh pot of coffee for us both. And what conclusions have you reached during your early morning strategy session?" Thomas gathered his thoughts, organizing the papers in front of him. First, that you were right about the Westlake integration. I've been pushing the team to force a complete technical merger that isn't practical or economically sound. Sometimes the best acquisitions remain partially independent entities, I agreed, especially when the technical architectures are fundamentally different. Exactly. I've drafted a new integration approach that maintains Westlake as a companion product with data synchronization rather than full absorption. He pushed a document toward me. I'd appreciate your thoughts. I skimmed the proposal, impressed by the level of detail he'd managed to produce overnight. This is quite thorough. You've clearly been busy. Couldn't stop thinking about it after our conversation. Once I admitted the original plan wasn't working, alternatives became obvious. He leaned forward eagerly. But that's just the beginning. I've been reviewing all our strategic initiatives with fresh eyes. For the next hour, Thomas walked me through Horizon's complete business landscape, their product roadmap, customer acquisition strategy, competitive positioning, and financial projections. It was the most comprehensive briefing he'd given me since founding the company 5 years ago. I asked questions, offered observations, and occasionally challenged assumptions, all of which he received with thoughtful consideration rather than defensive pushback. "This is what I've missed," he said during a brief lull as our breakfast plates were cleared. "Your ability to see 5 steps ahead and identify the hidden connections between seemingly unrelated business decisions. Pattern recognition comes with experience," I replied. "When you've seen enough business cycles, certain dynamics become predictable." "That's exactly why we need you involved formally," Thomas said, pulling out another document. "I had our legal team work through the night on this. It's a proposal for your board observer role, expanded beyond what Evergreen originally outlined." I raised an eyebrow as I accepted the document. "Expanded how?" "It includes a special advisory position on our executive committee, with direct input on strategic planning and major financial decisions." He watched me anxiously as I read through the terms. "Is it too much? Too formal?" "I wanted to make sure your voice would be heard throughout the organization, not just at quarterly board meetings." The proposal was thoughtfully structured, outlining clear responsibilities without creating governance conflicts. It demonstrated genuine respect for what I could contribute while maintaining appropriate boundaries between management and board oversight. More importantly, it had been Thomas's idea, not something forced upon him by Evergreen's funding conditions. "This is well crafted," I said, impressed by the thoroughness. "Though I am curious about how the other executives will feel about adding a new voice to the leadership team, especially one who happens to be the CEO's mother." Thomas grimaced slightly. "That's actually something I wanted to discuss. I've called an executive meeting for this afternoon to introduce you and explain your new role. I'm hoping you can attend." "Today?" I was surprised by the urgency. "Thomas, shouldn't you give the team more time to adjust to the idea? This is a significant change in your leadership approach." He shook his head firmly. "No more delays. Horizon is at a critical juncture. We need your expertise now, not after weeks of political maneuvering and ego management." His expression turned rueful. "Besides, after what happened at dinner last night, the executive team needs to understand that our funding round comes with new governance expectations." I studied my son's face, noting the determination there. "And you're prepared for potential resistance? Daniel has been your partner from the beginning. He may see this as undermining his position." Thomas's expression clouded. "Daniel and I haven't been aligned for months. He opposed the Westlake acquisition, but couldn't articulate his concerns effectively. Instead of listening harder, I steamrolled him. Our partnership has suffered ever since." This was a new level of self-awareness from Thomas. I felt a surge of maternal pride at his willingness to acknowledge his missteps so frankly. "Perhaps my involvement could help rebuild that partnership," I suggested. "If handled correctly, I could be a bridge rather than a wedge. That's what I'm hoping, Thomas admitted. Daniel respects business experience. He's not caught up in the tech wunderkind mythology like some of our younger team members. And your CTO? Aiden, wasn't it? He seemed quite young. Thomas nodded. 29 and brilliant. Graduated from MIT at 20, worked at Google, then a series of startups before joining Horizon. He's a technical genius, but sometimes lacks business perspective. The eternal challenge, I mused, balancing technical innovation with business sustainability. Exactly why we need you, Thomas insisted. You speak both languages. You understand the technology well enough to earn the engineer's respect, but bring the financial discipline we've been lacking. I couldn't help but smile at the irony. For months, Thomas had been pushing me away, convinced my outdated business perspective had no place in his cutting-edge tech company. Now he was positioning me as the essential bridge between technology and business, the very role I'd played throughout my career. The meeting is at 2, Thomas continued. I've reserved the main conference room at headquarters. Nothing formal, just an introduction and overview of your role moving forward. He hesitated. That is, if you're willing. I considered the proposal before me, weighing the opportunity against potential complications. Becoming formally involved with Horizon would blur the lines between family and business, always a delicate balance to maintain. Yet the alternative, watching from the sidelines as Thomas potentially steered his company toward preventable difficulties, was equally problematic. I'll be there, I decided. But Thomas, we need to establish clear parameters. The company is still yours to lead. I'm there to advise, to question, to offer perspective, not to undermine your authority or second-guess every decision. Relief washed over his face. That's exactly what I want. Your wisdom without removing my accountability. He gathered his papers excitedly. This is going to transform Horizon. I can feel it. His enthusiasm was infectious, but as we parted ways outside the cafe, I couldn't help but wonder if the transition would be as smooth as Thomas hoped. Introducing his mother as a senior advisor would raise eyebrows, regardless of my qualifications. How his team responded would reveal much about Horizon's culture and Thomas's true leadership influence. I spent the intervening hours reviewing Horizon's public financial statements and recent press coverage, refreshing my understanding of their market position and competitive landscape. The more I examined the data, the more convinced I became that Thomas had built something with genuine potential. The foundation was solid. It was the execution that had begun to drift off course. At precisely 1:45, I parked my car in the visitors section of Horizon's modern headquarters in Seattle's South Lake Union District. The building was impressive, all glass and sustainable materials, with the company's distinctive blue Horizon Line logo illuminated above the entrance. Young professionals hurried in and out, carrying laptops and wearing the casual attire that had become standard in tech companies. I felt conspicuously formal in my tailored pantsuit and sensible heels, a reminder of the cultural gap between traditional finance and modern tech. For a moment, I reconsidered my clothing choice, wondering if I should have opted for something more casual to connect with the younger team members. Then I straightened my shoulders and dismissed the thought. I was who I was, a seasoned financial executive with decades of experience. Pretending to be something else would only undermine my credibility. The receptionist looked up as I approached, her professional smile warming with recognition. "Mrs. Wilson, Thomas said to expect you. He's waiting in the conference room." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the visitor badge she offered. "And it's Ms. Wilson, or Margaret if you prefer." She nodded, making a mental note. "Of course, the elevator to your right will take you to the executive floor. The conference room is straight ahead when you exit." As I rode the elevator to, the 4th floor, I considered how I would introduce myself to Thomas's team. First impressions would be crucial in establishing the right dynamic. knowledgeable but not overbearing, experienced but not rigid, supportive of Thomas's leadership, while bringing independent perspective. The elevator doors opened to reveal a spacious, open-concept floor, with glass-walled meeting rooms around the perimeter and collaborative workspaces in the center. Thomas was waiting for me, pacing slightly outside the largest conference room, where I could see several people already seated around a polished table. "Mom?" He greeted me with a quick hug before lowering his voice. "Everyone's here. I've told them we have an important announcement regarding the funding round, but nothing specific about your role yet." I nodded, appreciating his approach. "Let me follow your lead. This is your team, Thomas. How you frame my involvement will set the tone." He took a deep breath, visibly centering himself. "Ready?" "Always," I assured him. We entered the conference room together, and all conversation immediately ceased as 6 pairs of eyes turned toward us with varying degrees of curiosity and apprehension. I recognized Daniel Brooks from the previous evening's dinner, along with Aiden, the young CTO. The others were new faces, presumably the rest of Horizon's executive leadership. "Thanks for adjusting your schedules for this impromptu meeting," Thomas began, gesturing for me to take a seat beside him at the head of the table. "As you know, last night was a pivotal moment for Horizon. I'm pleased to confirm that Evergreen Venture Capital has agreed to lead our Series B funding round, with strong interest from Redwood Partners and Sequoia Ridge as well." Murmurs of congratulation circulated around the table. Daniel Brooks studied me with undisguised curiosity, clearly sensing there was more to the story than a standard funding announcement. "The investment will allow us to accelerate our expansion plans and strengthen our market position," Thomas continued. "However, it also comes with new governance expectations." He paused, glancing at me before continuing. "Many of you know my mother, Margaret Wilson. What you may not know is that she's Evergreen's senior investment advisor for technology ventures and a key decision-maker in their funding commitments." The reactions around the table ranged from surprise to confusion, to dawning understanding. Daniel's eyebrows shot up, while Aiden looked completely blindsided. As part of our agreement with Evergreen, Margaret will be joining Horizon in a formal capacity as a board observer and strategic advisor to the executive team. Thomas's voice carried a clarity and confidence I hadn't heard from him in months. Her experience in technology investment strategy will be invaluable as we navigate our next growth phase. A moment of tense silence followed before Daniel broke it. "So, if I understand correctly, your mother evaluated our funding proposal for Evergreen and will now be overseeing how we use that investment." Thomas nodded. "That's essentially correct, though overseeing might suggest more direct control than the role entails. Margaret will provide strategic input and governance perspective, but day-to-day operations remain firmly in our hands." Daniel leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Interesting. Very interesting." "I want to be clear," I interjected, feeling it was time to speak for myself. "My role is advisory, not operational. I'm here to ask questions, offer perspective, and help ensure that Horizon's strategic decisions align with sound business principles. I'm not here to take control or second-guess the expertise in this room." A young woman at the far end of the table, whom I guessed was the chief marketing officer based on her stylish appearance, spoke up. "Thomas, with all due respect, this is unexpected. We've spent months preparing for this funding round, with specific governance structures in mind." "Plans change, Mia," Thomas replied evenly. "The opportunity to bring someone with my mother's experience into our leadership circle isn't one I'm willing to pass up, especially since it's a condition of our primary funding source." Aiden, the young CTO, had been unusually quiet, his expression difficult to read. Finally, he addressed me directly. "Ms. Wilson, no offense, but our technology stack is cutting edge. How familiar are you with containerized microservices, machine learning optimization, and distributed computing paradigms?" The question was clearly designed to establish technical boundaries, to position me as a financial person who couldn't possibly understand Horizon's technology. I'd faced similar challenges throughout my career from engineers who assumed financial executives were technologically illiterate. Familiar enough to understand their business implications, I replied calmly. I've evaluated technology investments for over 30 years, Mr. Aiden. That requires more than a surface understanding of the underlying architecture and its scalability characteristics. His expression remained skeptical. With all due respect, the tech landscape changes completely every few years. Knowledge from even 5 years ago is often obsolete. Some aspects change, I acknowledged. Programming languages evolve, frameworks come and go, deployment methodologies shift. But the fundamental principles of scalable, maintainable system design remain remarkably consistent. The microservices architecture you're so proud of is essentially a modern implementation of modular programming concepts that date back to the 1970s. Aiden blinked in surprise. More importantly, I continued, I understand the business implications of different architectural choices. When you decided to build Horizon's platform on containerized microservices, you gained deployment flexibility and team autonomy but created potential challenges in service discovery, distributed monitoring, and consistent error handling. Those trade-offs have direct impacts on development velocity, operational costs, and ultimately, investor returns. A stunned silence fell over the room. Thomas couldn't quite hide his smile. To be clear, I added, I won't be advising on specific technical implementations, that's your domain of expertise, but I will ask pointed questions about how technical decisions align with business objectives, and I expect substantive answers, not technical jargon designed to end the conversation. Daniel Brooks let out a low whistle, then surprised me by slowly applauding. I think I'm going to enjoy having you in our meetings, Ms. Wilson. Aiden looked less enthusiastic, but nodded with grudging respect. The marketing executive, Mia, still seemed uncertain, while the remaining 2 executives exchanged thoughtful glances. Thomas seized the moment to distribute copies of the role description we had discussed earlier. I've outlined how we'll incorporate Margaret's expertise into our governance and planning processes. As you'll see, this isn't about changing who makes decisions, but about enhancing how we make them. As the team reviewed the document, I observed their reactions carefully. Daniel appeared increasingly supportive, nodding at certain points. Aiden remained guarded but engaged. Mia and the others showed a mixture of caution and curiosity. I have a question, said a middle-aged man I hadn't met before. The document mentions your involvement in reviewing our competitive positioning strategy. Can you elaborate on what that means practically? Certainly, I replied. Horizon has positioned itself at the intersection of supply chain management and artificial intelligence, a promising space with significant growth potential. However, my initial review suggests you're emphasizing technological sophistication over demonstrable business outcomes in your market messaging. The man, whom I now suspected was the chief revenue officer, leaned forward with interest. Go on. Your current messaging focuses heavily on the advanced nature of your AI algorithms. But mid-sized manufacturers, your target market, care less about technical innovation and more about concrete results. Inventory cost reduction, improved delivery reliability, decreased stockouts. Your value proposition should lead with these outcomes, using your technical sophistication as supporting evidence rather than the primary selling point. Thomas interjected. This is exactly the kind of perspective I want us to incorporate into our planning. Mom, Margaret, sees patterns and connections that we sometimes miss while focused on product development and technical challenges. And this perspective comes with access to Evergreen's funding, Daniel noted, a hint of amusement in his voice. A convenient package. The funding would have been available regardless, I clarified. But Evergreen believes that companies perform better with diverse governance perspectives, particularly those that bridge technology innovation with financial discipline. The discussion continued for another hour, with each executive asking, questions about my role and offering their perspectives on Horizon's challenges and opportunities. Gradually, the initial tension dissolved into a more collaborative atmosphere, though I noticed Aiden remained somewhat reserved, and Mia occasionally exchanged concerned glances with Thomas. As the meeting wound down, Thomas addressed the group one final time. I want to emphasize that this isn't just about satisfying our investors. It's about recognizing that Horizon has reached a stage where we need broader perspectives and more rigorous governance. Margaret brings both, along with decades of experience evaluating technology businesses through multiple market cycles. And she happens to be your mother, Aiden pointed out, the hint of a challenge in his voice. Yes, Thomas acknowledged without hesitation. Which means she has a vested interest in Horizon's success beyond what any external advisor could offer. He smiled at me before continuing. It also means she won't hesitate to tell me when I'm making a mistake. A perspective every CEO occasionally needs but rarely receives. This brought knowing chuckles from around the table. Even Aiden's expression softened slightly. I look forward to working with all of you, I said as the meeting concluded. My door, or more accurately my phone and email, will always be open for questions, concerns, or discussions. I believe in transparent communication and constructive debate. As the executives filed out, Thomas lingered behind, waiting until we were alone before asking, "Well, what do you think?" "They're a smart group," I observed, cautious about my sudden appearance, which is healthy. Daniel seems pleased, Aiden is reserving judgment, and Mia is worried about her influence being diminished. Thomas laughed. Your people reading skills haven't dulled a bit. That's exactly right. He gathered his materials, looking pleased despite the mixed reactions. This is going to work, Mom. I can feel it. I wasn't quite as certain. Integrating a new voice, especially one with family connections, into an established executive team would inevitably create friction. The real test would come in the weeks ahead as my role shifted from theoretical to practical. Would you like a tour of the office? Thomas offered. Meet some of the team beyond the executive level? I'd like that, I agreed. It's important I understand the culture if I'm going to be effective in this role. As Thomas led me through Horizon's open concept workspace, I observed the energy and diversity of the team. Young engineers huddled around monitors discussing code. Product managers sketched user interfaces on digital whiteboards. Customer success specialists conducted remote training sessions with clients. It was a vibrant, dynamic environment, exactly what I'd expect from a growing tech company. What surprised me, however, was how people responded to Thomas. Employees straightened slightly when he approached, their expressions shifting from relaxed concentration to alert attentiveness. He was clearly respected, but there was an undercurrent of wariness that concerned me. The best leaders inspire comfort alongside respect, creating an atmosphere where honest feedback flows freely. Thomas seemed to have created a more hierarchical culture than I would have expected, given his own natural warmth. Thomas, called a voice from a nearby workstation. Do you have a moment to discuss the Miller implementation? The young woman who approached had the tired but determined look of someone wrestling with a challenging client situation. Thomas immediately shifted his attention to her, his entire demeanor changing from tour guide to problem solver. Lisa, this is perfect timing. I'd like you to meet my mother, Margaret Wilson. She'll be joining Horizon as a strategic advisor. He turned to me. Lisa Zhang is our senior implementation specialist. She handles our most complex client deployments. Lisa shook my hand with a firm grip, her expression curious but not alarmed by my presence. Nice to meet you, Ms. Wilson. Thomas mentions you often. Does he? I replied, genuinely surprised. Given how Thomas had been distancing himself from my input, I hadn't expected him to discuss me with his team. Oh yes, Lisa continued, apparently not noticing my surprise. Whenever we hit implementation challenges, he'll say things like, my Mother would tell us to step back and consider the business process before applying technical solutions. It's become something of a team mantra. I glanced at Thomas, who looked simultaneously proud and embarrassed. I may have internalized your perspective more than I let on, he admitted. It's one thing to quote your wisdom to the team and another to actually call you for advice. Male pride, Lisa Stage whispered to me with a grin. We see it a lot in this industry. In every industry, I corrected with an answering smile. As we continued the tour, meeting more team members and observing the operation, I found myself increasingly impressed with what Thomas had built. Horizon had a solid technical foundation, a clear market focus, and a talented team. The issues I'd identified in their strategic approach were real but fixable, precisely the kind of growth challenges that many successful companies encounter as they scale. What concerned me most was the culture of deference I continued to observe. People looked to Thomas for final answers rather than collaboratively working through problems. It reminded me uncomfortably of Pacific Northwest Financial during Bill's most autocratic period, a leadership approach that had nearly derailed the company during the Sherman Cooper crisis. When we finally returned to Thomas's office, a surprisingly modest space with glass walls that maintained visual connection to his team, I decided to broach the subject directly. You've built something impressive here, I began, settling into a chair across from his desk. The technology is solid, the market positioning is clear, and the team is talented. But, Thomas prompted, correctly sensing my reservation. But, I'm concerned about the decision-making culture. People seem to wait for your approval rather than engaging in robust debate. That's dangerous in a fast-moving industry where no single person can possibly have all the answers. Thomas frowned, clearly not having expected this critique. We have open discussions in our planning meetings. Everyone contributes ideas. Contributing ideas isn't the same as challenging flawed thinking, I pointed out gently. When was the last time someone on your team told you directly that you were wrong about something significant? He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, thinking. Daniel raised concerns about the Westlake acquisition. He finally offered. And how did you respond? Thomas grimaced. I listened politely and then explained why he was mistaken. After which he stopped pushing back, correct? Even though subsequent events proved his concerns were valid. Yes, Thomas admitted reluctantly. But that's not because I discouraged debate. It's because Daniel didn't make a compelling enough case. Or perhaps because he learned that disagreeing with you had no impact on the outcome, I suggested. Over time, that creates a culture where people save their breath rather than voice contrary opinions. My son looked genuinely troubled by this possibility. That's not the kind of leader I want to be. I know it isn't, I assured him. But leadership cultures evolve subtly, often without conscious intent. Your father faced the same challenge at Pacific Northwest Financial. His natural confidence and decisive style gradually created an environment where contrary voices fell silent, until the Sherman Cooper disaster forced a reckoning. Thomas was quiet for a moment, absorbing this parallel. So how did Dad fix it? He recognized that inviting dissent isn't enough. You have to visibly value it, reward it, and occasionally yield to it, even when you're not entirely convinced. I smiled at the memory. He instituted what he called reverse days in critical decision meetings, where he would argue against his own preferred approach and assign someone to advocate for it. Forcing himself to deeply consider the alternative perspective, Thomas mused. That's brilliant. It was uncomfortable for him at first, I acknowledged. Bill loved being right. But he came to understand that being challenged made his thinking sharper and his decisions sounder. Thomas leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. I think I've fallen into the same trap. I've been so focused on proving myself, on demonstrating visionary leadership, that I've stopped genuinely listening to contrary perspectives. He shook his head ruefully. Including yours. It's a common pattern, I assured him. Especially for founders who've achieved early success. The very confidence that helps you launch a company can calcify into rigidity if you're not careful. Another lesson from the Margaret Wilson playbook, Thomas said with genuine appreciation. I have a feeling the team is going to be getting a lot of these in the coming months. Only if they're open to them, I cautioned. My effectiveness as an advisor depends entirely on creating an environment where people feel safe, bringing me their concerns and challenging my perspectives just as vigorously as I challenge theirs. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. That's the culture I want for Horizon, one where the best ideas win, regardless of who proposes them. He leaned forward, sudden enthusiasm in his eyes. Starting with the Westlake integration approach, I want to present your alternative strategy at tomorrow's product meeting, but I'd like you to lead that portion of the discussion. Are you sure? That would be a significant change from the current plan. Might be better coming from you as CEO. He shook his head firmly. No, this is perfect. It demonstrates that I value external perspective enough to change course when presented with a better approach, and it immediately establishes your credibility with the technical team. I considered his reasoning and found it sound. All right, but I'll need complete technical documentation on both platforms to prepare properly. Thomas grinned. Already arranged. It's been uploaded to a secure server. I'll send you access details. His expression turned more serious. Thank you, Mom. Not just for helping with Horizon, but for not giving up on me even when I was pushing you away. That's what mothers do, I replied simply. We see our children's best selves, even when they temporarily lose sight of them. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the day's developments with cautious optimism. Thomas had demonstrated genuine openness to change, both in Horizon's strategic direction and in his leadership approach. The executive team had been understandably wary, but not openly hostile to my involvement. Most importantly, I'd been given a meaningful opportunity to help shape Horizon's future while strengthening my relationship with my son. There would be challenges ahead, certainly. Aiden's technical skepticism would need to be addressed through demonstrated understanding rather than assertions of authority. Mia's concerns about shifting power dynamics would require careful navigation, and the broader team would need to see consistent evidence that my involvement enhanced rather than constrained their work. But for the first time in years, I felt genuinely hopeful about Thomas's path, both as a business leader and as my son. He had built something with real potential, and with the right guidance, both he and Horizon could flourish beyond what either of us had imagined. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as I settled into my dual role at Horizon, board observer and strategic advisor. I maintained my office at home by the lake, commuting to headquarters 3 days a week while working remotely the remainder. The arrangement provided the perfect balance: enough presence to build relationships with the team, enough distance to maintain objectivity. Thomas had given me a modest office on the executive floor, nothing ostentatious, but with a clear message that I was part of the leadership team. The glass walls initially made me feel like a zoo exhibit as curious employees walked by, stealing glances at the CEO's mother, but I quickly grew accustomed to the fishbowl environment. My first significant challenge came during the product strategy meeting, where I presented the alternative approach to the Westlake integration. I had spent 2 days reviewing the technical architecture of both platforms, identifying the specific compatibility issues, and outlining a more pragmatic integration path. The room was packed, not just with the executive team, but with engineering leads, product managers, and the integration specialists who had been struggling with the merger for months. All eyes were on me as I stood at the front of the room, digital slides ready behind me. Thank you all for being here, I began, surveying the mixture of curious, skeptical, and hopeful faces. As Thomas mentioned, I've been reviewing the Westlake integration challenges and would like to propose an alternative approach. I proceeded to walk through the fundamental architectural differences between Horizon's cloud-native platform and Westlake's legacy system, explaining in precise technical language why a complete integration would require essentially rewriting Westlake from scratch, a process that would take years, not months. Instead, I continued, I propose we maintain Westlake as a companion product with 3 levels of integration. I clicked to a diagram showing the proposed architecture. First, unified authentication and user management. Second, synchronized data repositories with automated conflict resolution. Third, a consistent user interface layer that makes the 2 systems appear seamless to end users while maintaining their separate underlying architectures. The room was silent as the technical team absorbed my proposal. Aiden, the young CTO, studied my diagram with narrowed eyes, clearly looking for flaws. I had expected resistance from him, given his initial skepticism about my technical understanding. This approach, I concluded, would deliver the market promise of an integrated solution within 6 months, rather than the 2 years currently projected. It preserves the value of the Westlake acquisition while focusing engineering resources on enhancements rather than re-architecting. I paused, surveying the room. I welcome your thoughts and questions. To my surprise, it was Aiden who spoke. First, the synchronization between data repositories would be challenging, he said, rising to approach the diagram. Westlake uses a proprietary data model that doesn't map cleanly to our schema. Correct, I acknowledged, which is why I've outlined a transformation layer here. I pointed to a component in the architecture. A dedicated service that handles the bidirectional mapping between systems, with conflict resolution rules defined by business priority rather than technical convenience. Aiden's eyebrows rose slightly. You're suggesting an event-driven architecture for the synchronization? Precisely. Each system publishes changes to its data model, which the transformation layer processes according to defined rules before updating the counterpart system. It's an approach that's been successful in similar scenarios, particularly in financial systems integration. A flicker of respect crossed Aiden's face. That could work. We'd need to build robust error handling and recovery mechanisms. Absolutely. I've included those considerations in the detailed proposal. I clicked to another slide showing the recovery and monitoring architecture. For the next hour, we engaged in a detailed technical discussion that gradually shifted from skepticism to collaborative problem-solving. Engineers who had been struggling with the integration for months began offering suggestions, building on the framework I'd proposed. Even Aiden moved from critique to contribution, sketching modifications to my approach that would leverage Horizon's existing microservices infrastructure. Thomas remained notably silent throughout the discussion, watching the interaction with a small smile. He had positioned himself at the back of the room rather than at the head of the table, a deliberate choice, I suspected, to give my proposal space to stand on its own merits. By the end of the meeting, we had a refined approach and an implementation plan that the engineering team had helped shape. As people filed out, discussing technical details animatedly, Aiden lingered behind. Ms. Wilson, he said, approaching me as I gathered my materials. I need to apologize for my assumptions during our first meeting. Your technical understanding is unexpected. I smiled. No apology necessary. Skepticism is healthy in technology. Evaluation. It's why I prefer to demonstrate understanding rather than assert it. Where did you learn system architecture? It's not typically part of financial training. I've evaluated technology investments for 3 decades, Mr. Aiden. That requires more than surface knowledge. I make it a point to understand the systems I'm assessing, not at an implementation level, certainly, but at an architectural and capability level. He nodded thoughtfully. Most investors I've encountered barely understand the difference between front-end and back-end. let alone event-driven synchronization patterns. Most investors aren't very good at technology assessment, I replied simply, which is why so many make poor investment decisions in this sector. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Fair point. He hesitated, then added, "Would you have time to review our AI roadmap sometime? I'd be interested in your perspective on our prioritization approach." It was an olive branch, an acknowledgement that my input might have value beyond the immediate Westlake problem. "I'd be happy to. Send me the documentation and we can schedule time next week." After Aiden left, Thomas approached from the back of the room, barely containing his excitement. "That went better than I could have imagined," he said, keeping his voice low despite the empty room. "Did you see their faces when you started discussing event-driven architecture?" Aiden looked like he'd seen a ghost. I laughed. Technical? People often expect non-technical people to be completely ignorant. It doesn't take much knowledge to exceed those low expectations. You're being modest. That wasn't not much knowledge. You went toe-to-toe with our CTO on system design. Patterns. Thomas shook his head in amazement. "I knew you understood technology better than most financial executives, but even I was impressed." "I had a good teacher," I reminded him. "Your father insisted that I understand the technologies we were investing in, not just the business metrics." Thomas nodded, a shadow of sadness crossing his face at the mention of his father. "Dad would be proud to see you now, guiding Horizon's technical strategy." He paused, then added with genuine curiosity, "Why didn't you ever pursue a more technical role? You clearly have the aptitude." I considered the question as we walked toward the executive offices. I found the intersection of technology and finance more interesting than pure technology development. Understanding how innovative systems create business value, how to structure investments to support technical evolution while managing risk. I shrugged. That intersection has always fascinated me. "Which makes you perfect for your current role," Thomas observed. "Speaking of which, I've scheduled meetings with our key clients next week to introduce you. I think it's important. They understand the strategic direction we're taking with the Westlake integration." I raised an eyebrow. "You want me involved in client meetings already? Are you sure that's wise? Some might see it as a sign of instability in leadership." "On the contrary," Thomas countered. "Having someone with your financial and technical background involved demonstrates our commitment to sound governance. Besides, several clients have expressed concerns about the Westlake acquisition. Your approach directly addresses those concerns." His confidence in my ability to represent Horizon to clients marked another significant shift in our relationship. Just weeks ago, he had tried to hide me from investors at a dinner. Now, he was actively promoting my involvement with the company's most important clients. The client meetings proved unexpectedly rewarding. Most were mid-sized manufacturing firms whose leadership skewed older than Horizon's team. They seemed relieved to see someone closer to their age involved in strategic decisions, someone who spoke their language of ROI, operational efficiency, and risk management alongside technical capabilities. "Finally," one manufacturing CEO told me after a particularly productive meeting, "someone at Horizon who understands that we care about business outcomes, not technical wizardry." He glanced at Thomas, adding quickly, "No offense to your impressive platform, but my shareholders don't care about containerized microservices. They care about reduced inventory costs and improved delivery reliability." Thomas, to his credit, took the feedback graciously. "That's precisely why my mother's involvement is so valuable. She helps us translate our technical capabilities into business outcomes that matter to customers like you." The client relationships strengthened considerably over those weeks, with several expressing renewed confidence in Horizon's direction. The Westlake integration concerns, which had been threatening renewal discussions, largely dissipated once we presented our pragmatic approach, Not everything went smoothly, of course. Mia, the marketing executive, continued to view my involvement with thinly veiled resentment. During a strategy session on market positioning, the tension finally broke into open conflict. "With all due respect, Ms. Wilson," she said, her voice tight with controlled frustration, "our messaging strategy has been carefully calibrated to our target market. Pivoting to a business outcomes approach undermines months of brand development work. I understand your concern," I replied calmly. "But the evidence suggests your current approach isn't resonating effectively with decision makers. They don't select software based on technical sophistication. They buy solutions to business problems. Our primary buyer personas are technical leaders, CIOs, CTOs, IT directors," Mia countered. "They absolutely care about technical sophistication. They influence purchasing decisions, certainly. But they don't make final budget approvals. That's the CFO or CEO who care about business impact." I kept my tone collegial despite her growing agitation. Besides, even technical leaders ultimately need to justify investments to their business counterparts. We should arm them with business outcome metrics, not just technical specifications. Mia's expression hardened. "This is exactly what I was concerned about when you joined. Outdated marketing approaches being forced on us because of family connections." The room fell silent. Thomas straightened in his chair, clearly preparing to intervene, but I caught his eye and gave a subtle shake of my head. This was a challenge I needed to address directly. "Mia," I said, maintaining a level tone, "let me be clear about something. I don't care if you use my marketing approach or develop something entirely different. What I care about is effectiveness. If you believe your current messaging strategy is working optimally, show me the conversion metrics, the sales cycle length, the competitive win rates that support that conclusion." She blinked, clearly not expecting this response. "My suggestions aren't based on outdated principles or family connections," I continued. "They're based on customer feedback and sales performance data. The same data that shows our technical-focused messaging is underperforming with economic buyers." I leaned forward slightly. "If you have compelling evidence that contradicts this analysis, I'm genuinely interested in seeing it. That's how good business decisions are made, with data, not defensiveness." The challenge hung in the air. Mia glanced around the room, perhaps hoping for support, but found none. Daniel was nodding in agreement with my assessment. Thomas maintained careful neutrality. Others studied their notes or looked uncomfortable. "I don't have that data compiled at the moment," she finally admitted. "Then perhaps that's our starting point," I suggested. "Let's gather the performance metrics by message type and buyer role. Analyze what's working and what isn't. Then make decisions based on evidence rather than assumptions, mine or yours." Mia nodded stiffly, clearly unhappy but unable to argue with the approach. "I'll have the analysis ready by next week's meeting." The interaction had been tense, but necessary. It established that my role wasn't based on authority or family connection, but on sound business principles and evidence-based decision-making. More importantly, it demonstrated to the entire team that I welcomed informed challenge, that ideas would be evaluated on their merits, not their source. After the meeting, Thomas stopped by my office. "That was masterful," he said, closing the door behind him. I was about to jump in when Mia made that family connection comment, but your approach was much more effective. Defensive reactions only reinforce the perception of favoritism, I pointed out. Mia needed to understand that I expect the same evidence-based justification from everyone, including myself. She's been resistant since day one, Thomas acknowledged. I thought about replacing her, but her creative work is excellent when she's not being territorial. Give her time, I advised. Change is difficult, especially when it feels imposed. If her analysis shows that her approach is actually working better in certain contexts, We should acknowledge that and incorporate it. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. That's what Dad would say too. Strong opinions, weakly held. His favorite phrase for effective decision-making. One of mine as well, I smiled. Strong conviction balanced with willingness to change when evidence warrants. The mention of Bill's management philosophy led to a more personal conversation, one of many we'd begun having during quiet moments at the office or over dinner at my house. Thomas had started asking questions about his father's early career, challenges, clearly drawing parallels to his own leadership journey. Dad always seemed so confident in his business decisions, Thomas mused, settling into a chair across from my desk. Did he ever face something like this? A team resistant to his vision? I laughed softly. Constantly, especially in the early years. Your father had revolutionary ideas about technology's role in financial services at a time when most banks still considered computers glorified calculators. He faced tremendous resistance, not just from competitors, but from his own team. How did he handle it? Not always well at first, I admitted. Bill had a temper when challenged. He'd sometimes dismiss valid concerns as fear of change or lack of vision. It took several painful failures for him to recognize that listening to contrary perspectives strengthened rather than weakened his leadership. Thomas absorbed this quietly. I think I inherited that trait, the defensiveness when challenged. It's something I'm trying to work on. Self-awareness is the essential first step, I said, feeling a surge of maternal pride at his willingness to acknowledge this weakness. Your father didn't develop that until his 40s. You're ahead of schedule. Our conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Daniel Brooks entered, looking uncharacteristically concerned. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but we just received some troubling information. Nexus Dynamics announced a new AI-enhanced supply chain platform this morning. Their press release specifically mentions features that sound remarkably similar to our core technology. Thomas straightened. That's impossible. Nexus is a legacy vendor. They don't have AI capabilities anywhere close to ours. They do now, Daniel said grimly, handing Thomas a tablet with the press release. And their description mirrors our platform's unique functionality almost word for word. I watched as Thomas read the announcement, his expression darkening. This can't be coincidence. Their system architecture sounds identical to ours, right down to the predictive inventory modeling approach. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Someone gave them detailed information about our technology. This isn't competitive convergence. It's industrial. Espionage. Or a leak, I suggested quietly, both men turning to me. Has anyone left Horizon recently? Someone with detailed knowledge of the platform architecture? Thomas and Daniel exchanged troubled glances. Wei Chen, Thomas said, senior architect on the core platform. He left about 2 months ago. Said he was taking time off to travel, but Nexus would have needed time to implement these features. I finished the thought. The timeline fits. We had him sign all the standard non-competes and confidentiality agreements, Daniel noted. If he's working for Nexus, he's in clear violation. Legal protections are only as good as your ability to enforce them, I pointed out. And proving trade secret theft is notoriously difficult. The more pressing question is how we respond strategically. Thomas was already shifting to crisis management mode. We need to assess the damage first. Daniel, get Aiden and the technical leads together. I want a detailed comparison of Nexus's announced capabilities versus our actual platform. I need to know exactly what they've replicated and what they're bluffing about. Daniel nodded and left quickly. Thomas turned to me, his expression a mixture of anger and concern. This could be devastating. Nexus has a much larger customer base and sales force. If they've truly replicated our core technology, let's not catastrophize before we have facts, I suggested calmly. Even if they've duplicated some features, they lack our implementation experience and customer data. Technology is only part of the competitive equation. Thomas paced the small office. We should issue a statement, something asserting our innovation leadership and hinting at legal action. That would be premature, I cautioned. Reactive statements often create more problems than they solve. Let's gather information first, then develop a measured response that emphasizes our advantages rather than acknowledging a threat. He stopped pacing, studying me with newfound appreciation. Crisis management, another skill I didn't know you possessed. Pacific Northwest Financial weathered several competitive crises during my tenure, I reminded him, including more than one case of suspected intellectual property theft. Calm assessment always serves better than immediate reaction. Over the next several hours, Thomas's office became crisis headquarters. Aiden and his technical team dissected Nexus's announcement, comparing it with Horizon's actual capabilities. The sales team assessed potential customer impact. The legal department reviewed Wei Chen's exit agreements for enforcement options. I observed the process with interest, noting both strengths and weaknesses in Horizon's crisis response. The technical analysis was thorough and objective. The legal review was comprehensive. But the response planning showed signs of emotional rather than strategic thinking, focusing on punishing the perceived betrayal rather than mitigating business impact. When Thomas finally called for a strategy discussion among the executive team, the conference room hummed with nervous energy. Technology printouts and competitor analyses covered the table. Faces showed varying degrees of concern and determination. Here's what we know, Thomas began, standing at the head of the table. Nexus has announced features that closely resemble our core prediction engine and inventory optimization system. Their press release uses terminology specific to our architecture, suggesting inside knowledge rather than parallel development. Aiden jumped in. Based on our analysis, they've replicated about 60% of our core functionality. Enough to market similar capabilities, but without the full sophistication of our implementation. How long before they close that gap? Daniel asked. 6 months, minimum, even with our architecture as a blueprint, Aiden estimated. They still need to build the machine learning pipeline, train their models on real-world data, and refine the prediction algorithms. Mia spoke up, her earlier friction with me apparently set aside in the face of this common threat. We need to get ahead of this in our marketing, position Nexus as playing catch-up to our established solution, and accelerate our next-generation features, added another executive whose name I hadn't caught. Widen the innovation gap. I listened to the discussion, noting how quickly it had turned to outward-facing actions, marketing responses, feature acceleration, legal threats. Important considerations, certainly, but missing a critical dimension. What about our clients? I asked during a momentary lull. All eyes turned to me. How do we ensure they don't perceive Nexus as a viable alternative, particularly given their larger size and established relationships? Thomas frowned. We highlight our superior technology, our more advanced features. That addresses new prospects, I acknowledged. But what about existing clients who now have a larger competitor claiming to offer what they currently get from us? The announcement creates doubt about whether they made the right choice with Horizon. Understanding dawned on several faces around the table. We need to reaffirm their decision, Daniel said, nodding slowly. Not just with words, but with evidence. Precisely, I agreed. Each client needs personalized outreach that emphasizes the specific value they've already received from our platform. Concrete results that validate their choice of Horizon, making the Nexus announcement seem irrelevant to their context. Thomas looked thoughtful. That's a lot of customized outreach. We'd need to pull data for each client, analyze their specific results. It's worth the effort, I insisted. Think about it from their perspective. They took a risk choosing a smaller, newer vendor over established players like Nexus. Now that established player claims to offer the same capabilities. They're asking themselves if they made a mistake. We need to show them they didn't, with their own data. The discussion shifted to implementation details. Which clients to prioritize? What metrics would resonate most strongly? How to frame the outreach without appearing defensive. Throughout the planning, I noticed Thomas repeatedly building on my initial suggestion, expanding it into a comprehensive client reassurance strategy. When the meeting concluded 3 hours later, Horizon had a multifaceted response plan: client-specific success verification, accelerated feature development, carefully calibrated marketing messaging, and measured legal exploration. The panicked reaction had transformed into strategic response. As the team dispersed to implement their respective parts of the plan, Thomas lingered beside me. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for keeping us focused on what matters most, our clients' confidence." It's easy to get caught up in the competitive threat and forget that business ultimately comes down to customer relationships, I replied. Your father made the same mistake early in his career, focusing on competitors instead of clients during a market disruption. Another lesson from the Wilson family playbook, Thomas said with a tired smile. I'm beginning to think I could have saved myself a lot of trouble over the years if I'd just listened to you from the start. Perhaps, I acknowledged with answering smile. But some lessons need to be lived, not just heard. You're facing these challenges now when you have the maturity and self-awareness to learn from them. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Will you join me for the client calls tomorrow? Your presence would add weight to our reassurance efforts. Of course, I agreed. Though you should lead them. This is your company, Thomas. I'm just here to provide perspective. A perspective that's becoming increasingly valuable, he noted. The team has noticed, how your input consistently improves our decision-making, even in crisis. I felt a warm glow of satisfaction at his words. After decades guiding investment decisions behind the scenes, it was gratifying to have my contributions recognized so explicitly. More importantly, it signaled a healthy evolution in my relationship with Thomas, from estranged mother to respected advisor and partner. As I drove home that evening, watching the sunset paint Seattle's skyline in shades of gold and pink, I reflected on how dramatically circumstances had changed in just a few short weeks. From being deliberately excluded from a family dinner to becoming an essential voice in Horizon's strategic direction. From having my experience dismissed as irrelevant to having it actively sought during a company crisis. The irony wasn't lost on me. Thomas had tried to sideline me because he thought I was too old to contribute meaningfully to his modern tech company. Yet it was precisely that accumulated experience, the decades of witnessing technology trends, business cycles, competitive threats, and management challenges that now provided the perspective his young company needed most. Age, it seemed, had its advantages after all. And sometimes, it took a dramatic wake-up call for the younger generation to recognize them. 6 months after that fateful dinner at Cascade View, I stood at the back of the conference room watching Thomas deliver Horizon's quarterly results to the board. The numbers spoke for themselves. Client retention had increased to 96%. New customer acquisition had accelerated by 40%. And the Westlake integration, completed under my revised approach, had opened entirely new market segments. Our strategic pivot to emphasize business outcomes over technical features has dramatically shortened our sales cycle, Thomas explained, nodding toward me with open acknowledgement. And our client success metrics program has transformed customer relationships from transactional to consultative. The board members nodded approvingly. Even Helen, who had initially orchestrated my involvement as a governance safeguard, seemed impressed by the depth of my integration into Horizon's operations. After the meeting, as executives and board members mingled over coffee, Aiden approached me with an expression I'd come to recognize as his technical excitement face. The prediction engine enhancements are ready for review, he said, tablet in hand. We've incorporated your suggestion about adaptive learning parameters. The accuracy improvements are significant. From across the room, I caught Thomas watching our interaction with a smile. The young CTO, who had once questioned whether I could understand modern technology, now regularly sought my input on architectural decisions. It wasn't just Aiden. Throughout Horizon, the initial skepticism about the CEO's mother had transformed into genuine respect for what I contributed. Later that evening, Thomas and I sat on my deck overlooking the lake, celebrating the successful board meeting with a glass of wine. "I just got off the phone with Redwood Partners," he said, referring to one of Horizon's key investors. "They're increasing their stake in our next round. Said the combination of innovative technology and mature business governance makes us a uniquely attractive investment." "Mature business governance," I repeated with a chuckle. "Is that a polite way of saying they appreciate having someone with gray hair involved?" Thomas laughed. "Probably, but they're not wrong. Horizon is stronger with both perspectives, my technical vision and your business wisdom. The Wilson legacy in action," I observed. "Your father would be proud of what you've built." "What we've built," Thomas corrected gently. "I couldn't have navigated these past months without you, Mom. Not just the business challenges, but..." He hesitated, searching for words. "Reconnecting with who we are as a family." As the Seattle skyline lit up across the water, I reflected on how thoroughly circumstances had transformed. My son had once believed I was too old to contribute meaningfully to his modern tech company. Now, he valued that very experience as essential to his success. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. And sometimes those teachers have been waiting patiently in your life all along, simply needing the right moment for their wisdom to be heard. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.